Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the webinar. Let us all remember our Guru, Dr. C.K. Prahalad. His very name evokes emotions extraordinary. For many years in a row, Dr. Prahalad enlightened us with his original, relevant, and exciting thoughts on management, leadership, and entrepreneurship. He was the son-in-law of Ahmedabad, and on his annual visits to the city, he would invariably deliver his memorable talks on vital aspects of leveraging India to meet the challenges of a century of great uncertainty, unprecedented volatility, and dynamic stability, where the only stable entity is change. He was much ahead of his times, and what he said 10 years back is so much relevant today. Dr. Prahalad had immense faith in the ability, versatility, and flexibility of the leaders, managers, and knowledge workers of our country. In our country, the social and marketing culture changes every 500 kilometers. While most of us pursue globalization with anxiety, diffidence, and timidity, he perceived these as a great Indian advantage. What he perceived as crisis, he perceived as opportunities. What he perceived as problems, he perceived as challenges. What he perceived as setbacks, he perceived as learning. What you are going to listen today is so much relevant, useful, and applicable in the frustrating, uncertain, and volatile environment of today's world of business. Listen carefully. If possible, make notes because he would highlight restructuring by challenging us to understand the underlying causes and consequences of volatility, and then he will go on to coach us to do things differently. In the present century of uncertainty and dynamic stability, the markets behave differently in different times, in different places. Most of us have an ostrich approach where we deny what is happening around us because it disturbs our zone of comfort. He warns us on a preference for short-term gains that sooner or later promote dysfunctional behavior. With our mass media overcrowding the printed and the cyberspace with negativity, Dr. CKP wants us not to start believing in our self-generated complaints. Marketing gurus, for example, have prepared a formidable list of risks: financial risks, functional risks, sociological risks, psychological risks, time management risks. They feel that when a customer reaches for his wallet, all these risk factors are in front of him. Experts have tried to devise methods to neutralize these risks. Dr. CKP believes that we can neutralize the risks by accepting the fact that markets at different times in different places behave differently. We have to neutralize individual problems, forgetting that problems are always interdependent. We make 5-year plans. The experts teach us how to make 5-year plans, while they and we cannot predict what is going to happen next month. A teacher extraordinary, CKP warns us against mergers precipitated by financial crisis by comparing this behavior with that of a person without money. When a man has no money, he uses credit cards. Listen to such gems of speech by the business wizard. Make notes and using relevant advice, grow.
Advantage. Because the global crisis gets a lot of notoriety, very little understanding, and therefore what I want to talk about is the global crisis affecting India the same way it is affecting the United States, Europe, Japan, China, and South Korea? The answer up front is no. India is in good shape. India does not have subprime. It does not have toxic paper. It is growing at 7.5%. And I can tell you in most parts of the world, if you're growing at all, that would be considered a plus. India is growing at 7.5%. Of course, we should grow at 10%, but it's growing at 7.5%. The agriculture productivity has gone up and the production has been good, and therefore there is money in the rural market. And in partly in jest, but is serious in a funny way, we are going to go through the election. That's the stimulus package. So there's going to be a lot of money spent in the election. So there's going to be more money in the hands of people. So consumption-led growth is going to make India look very different in 2009 and 2010. And of course, every business person, everybody who writes in the media says how bad the situation is. And sometimes I think complaining is a good thing, but we can start believing in our own complaints. So my job is to make sure that we do understand the underlying causes and consequences of volatility. Why did this happen? What are the implications? And then come back to say, how does India take this and convert that into her own opportunity? And that, I think, is the substance of what I'm going to do. So I will do it in two parts. Part one is talking about the underlying causes, and part two is therefore what? How do we do things differently? The first thing that I think we need to recognize, and there are lots of MBA students here. How many of you are in the MBA program or some management program here? Great. I think the first lesson the crisis has taught everybody, and I hope we never forget it again, markets do not extinguish risk, but distributes it. Risk does not go away. It is handled by somebody else. So we just assume we can create products where we can distribute the risk in 100 different ways and hope the risk will go away. Unfortunately, it didn't. Neither do markets do not extinguish leverage. It just distinguishes itself in different forms in different places. Second, I think, coupled with this was a complexity and conspiracy of denials. There is a lot of denial on what is going on. From 2007, there were voices raised on not as a major effort by a large number of people to talk about the nature of the crisis likely to happen, but enough. All of them were ignored because it was very uncomfortable. So there was some denials, and we had enormous pressure for growth, profitability, and executive compensation tied to profitability and short-term growth. And I think we also can learn some lessons from what are the implications of executive compensation that is totally out of control, totally related to profit and short-term growth when you're creating long-term liabilities. And I think we can ask that question. It will be asked over and over again. The answer to that is not dramatically cutting executive compensation like Barack Obama has just done, but to really ask the question, what are the appropriate basis on which you compensate, and how do you make sure that compensation does not lead to dysfunctional behavior, that compensation is appropriate and adequate, but does not lead to behaviors that are dysfunctional. The thing that we don't get a lot of discussion about, in the United States, the regulatory design was oriented towards innovation. Now, India is safe because we did not innovate in financial products like the United States did. Our regulators were much more cautious, and thank God for it. In retrospect, we can thank them. So when you have unfettered innovation in financial products and poor regulatory oversight, that is a very clear and potent mixture for disaster. So in the Bush years, we had both very light oversight and extreme level of innovation. So there is a lesson here for us as well. And for those of you who do finance here, value at risk calculations, and we can go into the math behind it, but that's not the purpose of this. It ignored systemic risks by looking at trends, not looking at discontinuities. You tend to look at value at risk at the end of each day in a very different way in a bank or a financial institution than what really is going on. And finally, I think we underestimated the entire complexity of the system. Very few people really understood the total complexity, and therefore, managing individual deals was distinctly different from managing an interdependent global set of problems that suddenly hit. So it was sort of almost getting to a tipping point. So I think we can take shots at individual companies, we can take shots at individual managers, but what we need to recognize is this was a systemic risk, and the failure, because of the sheer size and magnitude, is going to have big long-term implications. So if you look at what has happened, this has had a huge geographical impact, not just the United States, but Europe. If you look at what happened in Iceland, Ireland, UK, Spain, in Japan, in China, and South Korea. The industry impacts go beyond just mortgages. I believe there is going to be a huge credit card crisis. People are losing jobs, they have to pay their bills, they're going to use the credit cards, and they're not going to be able to pay. So it is not rocket science to predict the next crisis is going to be credit card crisis, and that is going to be even bigger. But because people don't have jobs and they don't have access to credit, automotive, retail, capital equipment, all of them are depressed. And of course, there are pockets of layoffs in this country, maybe textiles in Tirupur, jewelry exports from Surat, but nothing like what is happening in the United States or in Europe, where there is massive layoffs, 2 million just in a year in the United States. That is significant. China is having huge problems with laying off people because all their export-driven industries are shuttering down, and they have to send people back to the villages. It's going to be a huge issue. And there is currency impacts. We assumed for many years, in the last 5 years, the dollar will always be favorable to us. Sometimes it goes the other way. That's the nature of foreign exchange. And so with the euro, so with the pound. There is a lot of implications of the finance and the system of finance as we know it. There's also going to be very interesting restructuring that's going to take place. Well-known firms are declaring bankruptcy. Lehman Brothers are gone. I mean, it's a 150-year-old institution. I think there's going to be forced and opportunistic mergers. Countrywide, Merrill Lynch with Bank of America, Wachovia and Wells Fargo. Wells Fargo was a perfectly well-run bank. You put a well-run bank with a sick bank, the whole thing becomes sick. Bank of America was a very well-run bank. You put Merrill Lynch with Bank of America and Countrywide, which is a disaster case, then Bank of America looks sick. So Bank of America, Wells Fargo, Citibank, for all practical purposes, they're nationalized. They're back to where India was, nationalized banks. Nobody wants to call them nationalized. When the Royal Bank of Scotland, 70% of it is owned by the government of UK. That is called nationalization in my book, but they don't call it nationalization. The government bailout is going to be significant, and it's not done yet. And therefore, the implications of that is going to go into everything, including electronics, hospitality, and so on. So all major players will be burdened by government systems. In fact, what is interesting for me is Citibank or Royal Bank of Scotland or Lloyds or Barclays will behave like a nationalized bank. Now, is it good news or bad news for Indians? What do you folks think? That means all your key competitors are going to be burdened by systems that they have no idea how to handle. At least in India, we have handled it for 60 years. So if nothing else, we know how to manage a regulatory process. They have no clue on how to do it. So I believe that all of them will slow down in their decision making, will become totally risk averse, and therefore we have an opportunity not to take over Citibank, but get bits and pieces of Citibank. In other words, dismember a large bank, one small bite size at a time. Don't try to swallow it, because if you swallow it, you accept all the liability. But just buy the pieces that you want and build a new structure around it. All of them will be focused on their portfolio and operational restructuring. They are not going to have time for worrying about emerging markets. They're going to be focused on their principal markets. And lot of churn in senior management. If ever you wanted to get well-trained, extremely talented people in any field, this is the opportunity for India. They're all available, and most of them are unemployed. If we are smart enough, we should be sending our headhunters to get the best talent and equip ourselves for the next round. This is the primary investment that we should be making, not in buying distressed assets, but buying the best talent that is coming out of distressed assets, because they know what not to do and they're also well trained. So the question is, how do you get an opportunity to change the game? How do you buy distressed assets, one piece at a time? Or how do you use increased access to talent in a creative and productive fashion that we have not done before? So, and I think it's very important to recognize the impact of the current crisis on Indian firms is all over the map. Therefore, don't paint all Indian industry with the same brush and say India is going to have a problem. If I look at businesses which are singular focus, but market and revenue focus is totally either domestic or global, IT services will do quite well. Maybe there will be a small blip for 2 or 3 months or 6 months, but all these companies have to figure out how to make their systems to work together. Nobody knows as much about how to make legacy systems work as Indian companies. So I believe Indian companies will have an extraordinary field day in IT services. Not all of them, but most of them who have the skills. Pharma will have a huge opportunity. What's going to happen? Because of unemployment, because of problems of healthcare costs, there is going to be a lot more focus on pharma prices. And India is sitting pretty with generics. Now, Mr. Patel tells me he is not worried. Actually, he's quite optimistic. Is that fair? He is not alone. Therefore, to look at automotive component industry and project the same problem to pharma and IT does not do us any good. So I say, become granular, become sophisticated in understanding what the implications are. On the other hand, ICICI Bank is perfectly safe. They are exposed, but not overly exposed to global markets. They're primarily India-oriented still. State Bank of India is primarily India-oriented. So our banks are in great shape. But if you look at Mahindra Group and Tata Group, it varies across the board. If I look at Tata's, for example, TCS I can take out and put in the IT services category. TCS will do fine. On the other hand, Tata Motors will be in a different position because of Jaguar and Land Rover. So I think what I find fascinating in the last 10 days, I've been traveling around India, is there is not a granular understanding. There is a big brush with which we paint good, bad, and the ugly and say there is a major crisis. And if you do that, then you don't know what are the levers that you can use, what are the opportunities for making a change. So I think we need to ask the question that are all of them bad? Some of them bad, but some of them have an opportunity for dramatic growth and repositioning themselves in the global marketplace. So I believe that the essential problem that we have to deal with is what I like to call volatility. Volatility in commodity prices and commodity markets. Oil, for example, went from $65 to $145 and back to $45. Now, think about what happens if you're in chemicals business. The entire structure of your economics has changed in less than 18 months, not in one direction, which you can adjust for, but extreme volatility. If you're in FCMZ business and you're making soaps and shampoo, access to vegetable oil and vegetable oil prices is huge. If you're making detergents, you have the same problem with volatility with oil prices. The second, and this is important for all of us as managers and students of management to recognize, for the first time, significant changes in administration are taking place across the world. United States has a new administration, is just getting their feet wet. We don't know exactly how they will behave, how the stimulus package will work. India will go through an election. Maybe all of you know what the new administration will look like, but it's an interesting question. Japan is in deep trouble politically. Nobody's taking leadership. Europe, leadership is shifting constantly on a daily basis between UK, France, and Germany, and there is no unified voice in Europe, and Russia is unpredictable, autocratic government. That, I think, is a bigger concern for me rather than the financial crisis. How the regulatory regimes will change, how the markets will change because of public policy decisions may be as important. Of course, there is volatility in financial markets. Those of you who play the Indian stock market know there has been a lot of volatility. I also think that in the last 6 months, last 4 months particularly, the mood of the world has changed towards sustainability, ecology in a dramatically different way. I was in Poznan in Poland in the big meeting organized to prepare for Copenhagen summit. It was very interesting to see how much the mood has shifted. There was no decisions to be made in Poland. It was preparatory to Copenhagen, but the mood has shifted among ordinary people, among bureaucrats, among policymakers, and I want to come back to it. And of course, no need to talk about terrorism, genocide, pandemics, as creating enormous turbulence in markets. What happened in Bombay is just a taste of what is likely to happen. I hope it doesn't happen in India, but it happens in other parts of the world. And I think we need to remember in India that we live in a very unfriendly environment. Afghanistan, Pakistan, Nepal, Bangladesh, Myanmar, and Sri Lanka. That's not a good neighborhood. Right? So we need to ask the question, how do we manage when we are not in a good neighborhood? And internally, 1/3 of India is ungovernable. If any of you are interested, just take a straight line from Nepal to Telangana. It is Naxalite invested. 160 districts are out of control. And that is an issue that is going to affect business. That's an issue that is going to affect how the governments will have to react and what does home security mean and all the good stuff. So for those of you who are numbers oriented, you don't have to follow all these graphs. I just wanted to show you there is a lot of volatility. You can see this. This is not pleasant. It's not one direction. It goes up and down. This is something of interest to maybe all of you. This cars and two-wheeler sales in India by month. Now, can you tell me how do you plan for this growth? This is reality, is it not? For those of you who are more sophisticated, this is about savings index, real estate index, consumer spending index. The point I want to make is, in the last 18 months, last 12 months, we are seeing tremendous volatility. Volatility is a different problem from cost pressures. And we need to separate volatility as a distinctly different problem. So the administration's changes are fairly obvious. So what we need to ask ourselves is, A, do we need a new way of managing in a volatile environment? And if we want to have a new approach, how do we construct that approach so it gives us an opportunity to manage ourselves well here first and also project Indian management in the rest of the world, therefore the India advantage. The India advantage must start from domestic markets and then extend to global markets. So, over the last 10 years, from the same location, I've talked about focus on quality. That was 10 years ago, when we didn't have enough concerns about quality. Focus on productivity and cost. Focus on cycle time, speed, and innovation. We also have talked about focus on disruptive business models and innovation. So if you look at what we have done as a country in the last 10 years, focus on quality came to India because we adopted a methodology, call it TQM, training, empowering all people. So we had a problem to deal with, we had a known methodology to deal with that problem. Productivity was training, systems, overhead analysis, restructuring, and almost all companies went through it in some form during the 90s. Focus on cycle time was also about business processes and leveraging competencies, and I want to come back to it. And in the last 3 years, I've been talking about Innovation Sandbox. Some of you who are regulars will understand the Innovation Sandbox. We talked about BOP markets as a source of innovation, and I tried to communicate 4 A's rather than 4 P's in marketing. Many of you will remember awareness, access, affordability, and availability as the key organizing principles behind access to markets, especially the markets of the poor. So we need to ask the question, now that we have traveled this distance over the last 10 years, as businesses and as a country, because I don't think I need to go and give a lecture on quality and TQM today or Six Sigma. But believe me, 10 years ago, that was needed. So the question that I think we need to ask is, what is the methodology for dealing with volatility? The good news is, there is nothing you can go and borrow from somewhere else. TQM, we did not have to invent. We just had to learn and apply. Overhead analysis, we didn't have to invent. We had to go learn and apply. But volatility is a new problem for everybody, so we need to figure out how to do it, and that may be the next practice. So if you look at every company, I know a lot of my good friends from various companies, almost all their planning is based on what I call the assumption, fundamental assumption, future resembles the past. Therefore, we do trend analysis. Last year, we grew at 10%. The year before, we grew at 11%. So this year, we'll be a little bit more obstinate and grow at 15%. Is that fair or not? I don't want to put them on the spot. That is how we teach too. Whether our growth rates, seasonality in our markets, competitors' behavior, consumer preferences, the future is supposed to look more like the past. That is a perfectly legitimate way to do it. We also have 1 and 3 year plans. All of you do, is it not? Yes, no? What is the value of a 3-year plan when you don't know what's going to happen next month? But we still do 3-year plans. So every management practice that is based on the core assumption that the future will be more like the past will have to be examined when you have to confront discontinuities rather than trends. Volatility is about discontinuities, not about trends. So I say, managing discontinuities, the first principle is the past is not a predictor of the future. Therefore, how to cope and thrive requires a new methodology. So what this crisis must do for us is not to make us hunker down and do exactly what we should not do, just not innovate. I believe this is a big opportunity for us to move forward and innovate. And therefore, we need to ask the question, how do we do it? So managing in a volatile environment requires simple principles. So I'm going to suggest there are some things you have to do next month and the month after that. Fairly straightforward. Nothing that I'm going to say is going to come as a surprise to any of you here. But I think it is useful to remind ourselves that we have to do simple things well right now. Why? Because we should expect wild swings in input costs, revenues, and product and geographical mix, and sudden shifts in social preferences, and maybe a crisis. Now let me ask you the question, how many of you are willing to go out and buy a car even if you have a loan and you can afford it to pay, just pay cash? You're rich enough. How many of you are going to buy a nice car? Deals are available too. Or are you going to say, let me wait? What's the answer, most of you? Wait or buy? Why? You have the cash, the car is cheap, the guys are begging you, you can negotiate a good deal, why don't you buy? Indians are very conservative. That's good news. In fact, my recommendation to Americans is save. In India, my recommendation is spend. The problem is, if we don't spend here, we have a problem. This is what I call sudden shifts in preferences. Let me give an example to make my point. All of us who fly around the world know the probability of an accident in the air is 0.000 something. That's why we fly and don't worry about it. Let us assume there was one accident and your neighbor got killed. The next day morning, you want to go on and take a flight. You suddenly think the probability of an accident has increased for you? In other words, human inference has very little to do with objective probabilities. And this is a very well-established theoretical and practical belief, and assumptions about inference must be monitored very carefully if you're a business person, because social preferences can change very dramatically based not on what is good or what is objective, but how people feel about themselves. So the ability to scale up and down rapidly is quite critical. Capacity to hold on to operations is quite critical. And finally, reassessing priorities rapidly is important. So in other words, the antidote to volatility is cycle time for management decision making. Because when you talk about cycle time, we always think about innovation and so on. We don't talk about cycle time for management decisions. Let me ask the question for you. You don't have to answer me because it's a funny question to ask. What is the time it takes from somebody to put a project proposal together to the time finally it gets approved in your company? Is it 1 week, 2 weeks, 6 months? What is it? Just think about it. In this environment, you better act in 1 week, not 6 months. And most of the time in summer, don't put a project proposal together because it's so hot in Ahmedabad, everybody's in Europe. There is no hope of anything getting approved. So I think clarity to long-term direction, agility in the short term is the answer. So I say what to do here and now is fairly straightforward. Conserve cash. Everybody already knows that, so there is nothing new. I think what India needs also do is to create war on waste. Whether it's receivables, inventories, logistics, energy, I'll come back to it a little bit. Because India grew so fast in the last 5 years, every company, irrespective of how well managed it is, must have slipped on some of these issues. This is a good time to consolidate it. This amazing amount of cash that's available in Indian companies, if we just put a little bit screw tight on inventories and receivables alone. It's amazing how much. And I've seen in the last 3 months how much cash can be generated in a large company. Do not build for stock. Because if you build for stock, A, it costs you money. Number two, preferences can change. So the question is, how do I rethink my manufacturing so I reduce the cycle time between receiving an order and manufacturing? Should I go from batch manufacturing rather than just bulk manufacturing? And lower the break-even. How many of you have a break-even of 30 or 40% of your capacity? Anybody here? If you have 30 or 40% break-even, you're in great shape because you have enormous room for volatility management. Shift to newer businesses that are lower risk and you can learn fast. One of the things that I find interesting is even in the automotive component sector, some companies have moved very rapidly. They knew the problem was coming because they saw the orders in GM and Ford going down. Instead of waiting for a crisis, they shifted a large number of their engineers into other related opportunities like windmills. Windmills is a growing business. It requires the same engineering knowledge that you have in component manufacturing. But they did not say component manufacturing and windmills are two different businesses. They said they have the underlying same skill base. So one of the things we can come back to is we got lost with saying core competence is not important. Maybe you're coming back and saying focusing on core competence may be a lot more important than we thought. This is a simple list, obvious list. Just doing this will give a lot of time for us to react to other bigger opportunities. So the question is, do we need a new methodology? I said, you need two contradictory requirements. And I think this is very important. One, you must have strategic clarity and consistency, and simultaneously operational agility and resilience. It is not enough if you can change rapidly. You must be always consistent in the direction in which you're going. Otherwise, you'll go around in circles. There is no progress to be made in going in circles. On the other hand, if you have tremendous clarity but no agility, you'll be caught on a very bad wicket. So you need to do both. And more importantly, shift management focus from wait and react or sense and respond to anticipate and create. So two things, strategic clarity and agility, the capacity to anticipate and the capacity to create new opportunities for yourself. Call it entrepreneurship, call it innovation, I'm perfectly fine with it. But you must create new opportunities for yourself. So we can go down the business requirement from conserving cash to rapid scaling up and down, reduce the risk, rebalance the portfolio, still maintain a global perspective, rethinking business models, and so on. I believe if you start with these requirements, you end up with a very simple sandbox. I just call it the Volatility Sandbox. One side, the bottom of the sandbox, which is fundamental, is capacity for real-time reconfiguration of resources. How fast you can move the pieces around inside the company, especially in a large company, is a critical attribute on how you can manage volatility. If you take 6 months to adjust, if you take 2 years to adjust, you have a bigger problem than you think. If you can move that in 1 week or 2 weeks, then it is huge advantage. We'll come back and see what it means. Second, continuous churning of business models. If your business models are stuck with a certain set of assumptions and the assumptions change, we should have enough capacity to change ahead and make a new business model happen. For example, I'll give you a very practical, down-to-earth example. You hedge on vegetable oil because your products, soaps, require vegetable oil. You thought you took a very smart hedge, but the price of vegetable oils have dropped so far below that nobody could have anticipated. Now suddenly your competitors did not hedge and they can exploit low-cost vegetable oil, and therefore they can drop the price of soap. What do? And that is a kind of question, how do you change your business model? That I think is very important. We'll come back to that. Third, create low capital intensity by building an ecosystem. Don't try to do everything yourself. In other words, the days of vertical integration are over. Vertical integration reduces your capacity to scale up and down rapidly, to be agile, but you must create an ecosystem that is equally agile and you have an intellectual influence. And finally, focus on anticipation. What is the new game? How will it change? So within the sandbox, we can do a lot of change. For example, we can take anticipatory initiatives, and I'm going to at least talk about one in great depth. We can move to science-based business so it can extract greater value. I think 2 years ago, I spent a lot of time here looking at science-based businesses. If you remember, brain studies, mathematics, artificial intelligence, and all the good things. Global perspective is obvious. Last year, I spent a lot of time looking at how to innovate. We just called it N equal to 1, one consumer experience at a time, and R equal to G, which is resources from large variety of players, which is building an ecosystem. But you can't do it without IT systems. Now I'm going to take it one step further and give some examples. Focus on core competence. And I like to call organizations Velcro organizations, where you can bring various business units and functions together to address a task, engage and disengage like Velcro. All of us are familiar with Velcro. The question is, why can't our organizations function like Velcro? Why do we have to reorganize every time we want something to be done? If every time you have to reorganize, you spend an enormous amount of time and energy inside the company. And finally, focus on enterprise risk. At the heart of it is strategic clarity. So we could have spent an evening on any one of those, and that is not the purpose. I just want to illustrate this methodology. Therefore, bear with me if I only skirt around some of these. So let us think about poor farmers and whether IT can help. So how many of you would like to help this farmer? Anybody? Nobody wants to help him? No. Okay, now I can see a lot of hands. What are the approaches we have taken to help him traditionally? Subsidies and write-off loans. We paid 70,000 crores writing off loans. Is it not? Now the question is, did it help this farmer? Or no? Hey, 70,000 crores is a lot of money. Why did it not help this farmer? It did not change the way he works. It did not change the way he understands how to sustain his agriculture. We just gave him a loan, and say, now all your loans are written off, hopefully, if he got the money. It only allows him to borrow again. That is not the solution. Could you have done something totally different as a country with 70,000 crores? What if we did land mapping? We have satellites, we have geospatial technology. Actually, today I can get 0.4 meter resolution of any part of India. 0.4 meters. That is as small a place as you can get. So I can do land mapping, I can do soil mapping, I can look at crop patterns, skill levels, and what markets and prices are. Can I get a specific solution for each farmer in Gujarat based on where he lives, what crops, what is the soil composition? Can I give him advice on what crops to grow, what fertilizers, how much fertilizer, and how much pesticide? How many of you think this is a technically feasible solution? You think we could have done it for 70,000 crores? I'd like to ask the question, why did anybody not say this? Is it because the problem does not exist? We have the problem. We also can have creative solution to this problem, but somehow something stops us from saying the only thing we can do is to give money. Now, more interestingly, most of the infrastructure for doing it already exists in India. That is even sad. ITC Chopal case you have all heard of. They already connect with these farmers. So you already have the ability to take satellite pictures, locate the land, and these farmers can give you a little bit of soil for testing. And you can test it right there, upload all that data very easily. We already have information on prices and quality. For example, Reuters today is selling a cell phone subscription for 170 rupees in Maharashtra. 2 months or 3 months, 100,000 subscriptions. What do they give? For 170 rupees, they give weather and market prices of brinjals or okra or tomatoes or potatoes, whatever they sell. The farmers love it because they can make more money. Same thing with fish in Kerala. Can we give agricultural services through the same pipe? Insurance, self-help groups, we all have this. We have cell phone coverage. In other words, most of the infrastructure exists, and we are not creating a business by connecting the dots and really helping this farmer. Is it a good business for you if you're a business person? Can you make money here? You bet. Can you also help the farmer? You bet. At least it will avoid having another 70,000 crores 2 years from now. You can say this is far-fetched. Fair enough. You can do it in any area, education, agriculture, energy. You can do it using cell phones, wide variety of things. There is one way of starting to think about opportunity, because suddenly we can change the game. We don't have to do the same way. But let's also anticipate new opportunities that India can exploit. I'll set some context and talk about why large firms, why framework for innovation is required, and how do we move forward. Is this the reality in India? Climate change, problems of energy, extremely stressed water systems and water quality, tremendous problem of erosion of biodiversity, chemicals and metals in our wells, deforestation, fisheries disappearing, natural fisheries, so everything is farm raised, ozone layer, enormous amount of waste management. If you don't believe about pollution and waste, when you take the next flight out of Ahmedabad airport, when you're going across the runway, look on both sides. The number of plastic debris, it's unbelievable for me. And the amazing thing is, nobody seems it's a good idea to clean it up. So, air pollution. How many of you think this is going to be a problem for India in the next 5 years? What are we doing about it? Is it a good question? Is there a business here? Is there something that we can do as a country? Can we leapfrog the West if we figure out how to do this during the crisis? So I'm going to ask you, this is an interesting chart on what is happening to global fisheries. This is the timeline. So from starting on 58, I wanted to see what has happened to global fisheries. When it gets to be totally pink, it means it is all sub-peak harvest. That means there's still some fish, but it's not peak harvest anymore. Every system is stressed. Just take a look at it one more time. So we don't need any more discussion of this issue, because if we look at the pressure on the planet, it's a function of people and quality of life. Typically 1.5 billion people in the rich countries stress the planet till 2000, maybe 1995. Now, 6 to 7 billion people will stress the planet when we start giving them the minimum standards of life. Now, this is going to happen, is it not? Is everybody drinking Coke? Is everybody buying packaged foods? Frito-Lay? Is everybody wants to use shampoo? Everybody wants to grow more food? Everybody wants to use more fertilizer? So this is going to stress our system. And India is at the forefront of where the stresses will be. Now, I like to ask the question, is this a good time for India to take the leap and say, we are going to be the first country in the world which understands how to manage it? I'll give you a simple example. The price of oil went up to 160 or 145, 150. So there was a lot of concern in India. The price went up dramatically of LPG and oil, diesel, everything. And everybody went on strike. All that is good. Now it's back to 45. Should we give it all back, or should the government keep a portion of it and totally invest in solar so that we don't have this problem? And Gujarat and Rajasthan are blessed with sunlight, too much of it maybe. The interesting question for me is, why can't we develop asymmetric patterns of investment that allow us to become energy and carbon neutral within 5 to 10 years? Because we have not developed a grid-based system, we have not become as addicted to fossil fuels in our infrastructure as developed countries. We're just starting to get there. This is the time to intercept and change. So you can take 3 different debates globally. In the United States, the debate is reduce the environmental impact by policy and regulation. The ecological footprint is quite significantly different in the United States, equivalent to 9.6 hectares per person. Finland is 7.7, China is 1.6, India is 0.8. That's good news. We don't have to go to 9.6. We will not be able to get there with 1.2 billion people. So this is a good time to shift, but we still think policy and regulation is the key. Some people say, reduce the environmental footprint by education. Maybe. That's not a bad thing. And I know in at least some parts of India, every high school student has to learn something about the environment and ecology. That's good. But you won't do it by yourself. So the question is, why can't we reduce environment impact by changing the process of industrial development, which gives the opportunity for value creation, revitalizing businesses, and focusing on inclusive growth? We don't want to leave any Indian behind in terms of quality of life, but we also want to be ecologically sensitive. That means In the US and in Europe, sustainability means compliance to regulation. Can we convert that in India to say sustainability means innovation, so we change the way we work? Now, you can say that's a tall order. So I thought I'll give you some early opportunities, some examples. And the large firms in India have a significant opportunities. They are not adversaries, they can be allies in changing the ecological footprint. Because if you look at why Walmart is so interesting, what's the advantage? There are thousands of suppliers around the world. They all have to go through a small gate called Walmart, and they have millions of consumers on the other side. That's a nodal gate. Therefore, they can influence both sides. Large companies here have exactly the same opportunity. If I look at Tata's, if I look at Reliance, if I look at Mahindra's, Birla's, and so on, or many of the public sector companies, they have a huge opportunity to both influence their suppliers and dramatically influence their consumers. And they recognize that the social pressures will increase, not reduce. They don't have to deny the social pressures. They can create a new logic for value creation. So large global ecosystems, ability to enforce standards, scale and scope is a huge advantage. So let's not think of large companies as negative or as adversaries. Large companies become allies in creating a sustainable system in India. So let's think about a framework for innovation. We can go from reducing carbon emissions to changing the energy profile of our companies. And I'll come back to that. Going green is nice, but becoming sustainable is a better way to think. Reduce environmental risks of the firm to sustainability as an innovation platform. If you make those three transitions, given volatility, recession, profit pressure, we must think about sustainability as one way of dealing with volatility, recession, emerging markets, and profit pressure, all at the same time. So this may be one way of thinking about just sustainability. One is, what is the level of maturity of your company or capacity for innovation, going from compliance to sustainable operations, to sustainable product and services, to new business models, and to next practices. And also, how well do you integrate a sustainability agenda into the heart of the organization? What I'll do is I'll take each step and I'll give you some examples just to motivate the opportunity in India. Unfortunately, most of the examples do come from other parts of the world, but nobody has figured out how to do all five. That should be our advantage. First is compliance. All companies learn how to comply. But if you look at what is happening, compliance is very state-based or country-based, not global. So what happens in San Francisco in the same state of California doesn't happen in San Diego. For example, plastic bags are totally banned in San Francisco 2 years ago. In San Diego, I can go to a retail store and get plastic bags. In Delhi, plastic bags are banned. Is it not? Yes, no? Why not in Ahmedabad? I wanted to think about this. Why is it we have to wait? CNG is the only way you can drive a bus in Delhi. Do you have to have compulsory CNG buses here? Yes? How about Pune? Anybody been in Pune? Every time I go to Pune, my eyes start watering. Then I have to tell my friends, I am not overwhelmed by looking at you, my just eyes hurt. So, emission standards, California standards are different from the rest. And the electronics business, European standards are very different from the United States standards. So for a global company, this creates confusion, but because it's compliance, the lawyers make sure it happens. There is carbon trading regimes, which are penalty for polluters, does not reduce carbon emissions. So if you look at what is happening, the cost of compliance is increasing, but it's also an opportunity to experiment. And mandatory compliance can create resource-neutral capabilities, but that's the starting point. But companies are moving very, very much beyond. For example, in high-tech area, IBM, AT&T, and so on, they surely expect 50% of their employees to do telecommuting. It's another way of thinking about outsourcing. When we can do the work in Chennai and Pune, why do people have to come to work every day? How many of you think that's a great idea? Work from home. Why? Can you imagine the person sitting in a car or a bus for 2 hours in Bangalore before he or she gets to work? What kind of mental frame is that person in? And then you have to go back. In fact, they're finding that productivity goes up dramatically if people work. Second is logistics improvement. Many of you know UPS, which is just a trucking company which delivers parcels. They have 100,000 trucks just in the United States. They figured out if the trucks don't take any left turn, that means they don't have to stop at red lights. And if they can load the parcels in such a way, which is just mathematics, the last in, first out. So people can take the parcels out in sequence, every truck in the United States. They save 30 million miles or 3 million gallons per day. Now, I like to pose in Ahmedabad a simpler question. Is disciplining this traffic going to dramatically reduce both pollution and fuel consumption? How much you think is the result of congested streets, people not following the rules? What percentage is it? 2%, 5%, 20%? Anybody knows the answer? But why is it nobody is concerned about this question? Let's not become very sophisticated by loading trucks in a funny way. We can just reduce dramatically our fossil fuel requirements by just being disciplined in the road. And from this podium, I've asked many times, why can't we draw lanes in every street, and why can't we enforce the discipline? Put some people in jail. Don't put the driver in jail. Put the owners in jail. That's the only way to solve the problem. I want you to think about it. It's a huge opportunity. Reverse logistics. People used to throw away things. Now Cisco brings all the routers back. They refurbish it and sell it. It saves them money, and it's a $125, $150 million business in less than 2 years. New standards. Walmart just went and said to all their suppliers in China, thou shalt follow these rules, otherwise we won't buy. If Walmart says you follow the rules, even the Chinese will agree, because they are the largest exporters out of China. So, changing materials. 30% of uncoated paper in Random House. Unilever will have 100% palm oil or tea from sustainable resources. And they are the largest buyers of palm oil and tea in the world. If Coke can reduce water usage by 20%, that is 50 billion liters. And I want you to think about the sheer magnitude of what we can do if all of us agree to make a difference. So this is just operational improvement. Then you can go to sustainable products. For those of you in marketing, how many of you think that Surf Excel or Tide, the big box that you find, is necessary for delivering the functionality? Anybody here? Or is it just to get a lot of visibility in the store space? Because somebody said, what would happen if you create a compact pouch, which is 1/3, which provides the same functionality? Can you imagine what it does to logistics costs? Dramatically different. Redesigned for consumer use. You have cold water detergents here, is it not? Yes? Or no? Or do you have hot water detergents? You guys don't wash clothes yourself? You must have servants to take care of it. That's the problem. I wanted to think about this. Godrej just introduced a new machine with a simple microprocessor where it knows where the cycle stopped. It doesn't start from scratch, from the first point. So if you've been running your machine and there is a power outage or water outage, which happens in India all the time, the machine knows at what point it stopped and it starts from there. That's a dramatic improvement. And it's a simple software-enabled machine. We can do lots of things like that. Redesign for recycling and reuse, like printer cartridges. Operating efficiency for desktops in terms of power consumption. And of course, core architecture of the business like Toyota hybrids. How many of you think India should be at the cutting edge of hybrid technology? Anybody wanting to work in this area? Not just electric cars, but hybrids. We have a problem here. So we should be the one to do it. Now, something more interesting. You can send packages from A to B, which is what FedEx does. They also bought Kinko's, which is office products, and a company that does copying and so on. So they say, don't send a package from Chicago to San Diego. Why don't you send it electronically? We will proofread it, bind it, and deliver it in San Diego. So 90%, 95% of the travel is electronic. Last 4 miles is physical. Think about the possibilities in India. Some other company says cement is one of the bad industries. It produces a lot of carbon dioxide. So a company says, what would happen if I do biomimicry? I mimic nature. How many of you follow Discovery Channel here? At least some of you must. You know how the coral reefs make all this good, fancy stuff? They take carbon dioxide. That's why people like the sink in the sea for carbon dioxide, add magnesium, calcium, and they create white cement. It's not Portland cement, but you can create through the same process a new form of cement which is pollution-free. Actually, it can take all the carbon dioxide from Portland cement and create white cement. Waste management. There is a company called Waste Management in the United States. There's about $14 billion. They haul wastage, all the garbage. That's their business. Big company. How many of you think there is a hidden business in waste? All the stuff that you and I pay for them to get out, they found there is $10 billion worth of commodities that people throw away. So if you know how to recycle, remove the toxins, suddenly your $14 billion business, which people give away junk for you to haul, you also have another round of recovering at least $4 to $5 billion worth of new materials. So it's a new business. So somebody is giving that to you free. We can also do solar. Actually, I find it interesting that Germany is one of the fastest growing solar markets. The company that's growing fastest in solar business is Chinese. They don't sell a lot of it in China, but they sell it in Germany. And we can also create, like Sun Edison, which is a California company, which says, we will come and install solar for you. You only pay per use. How many of you would be willing to pay same charges as grid-based electricity, uninterrupted, if it came from solar? Why doesn't somebody start a business that they allow for capital expenditures, but pay-per-use method, so they guarantee you good quality, uninterrupted electricity for more or less the same price, or marginally a little bit more, which mostly environmentally oriented people would do it. The real issue is how to deal with capital expenditure ahead of time, and how to deal with the regulatory problems of whether you can produce your own electricity or not. I know one person in this audience has tried very, very hard. Actually, when I go to his house, it doesn't seem to have any problem with air conditioning every nook and corner. He doesn't pay for it, he paid for it once. And everybody can have that advantage. And finally, why can't we think about non-grid energy? Build clusters with solar and wind. 50, 100, 200 clusters, not just only rural clusters, but urban clusters. Why can't, just like Tamil Nadu has made, harvesting of rainwater mandatory, why can't we make in Rajasthan and Ahmedabad every new business, every new real estate development must have solar mandatory? It adds a little bit to the capital cost, and then the operating costs are so much better. Why is it not possible for us to do it? Think about what the implications are. Why can't we create waterless detergents? It does not use water, but creates absolutely clean clothes and clean floors. Actually, I believe the technology already exists. I've seen it in many places. Why not convert coal into methane without mining? How many of you think that is possible by engineering bacteria which can convert coal into methane and therefore power without mining at all? That's the way I want you to think. Growing rice. Is a rice a big crop in India? Do you know how much water does 1 kilogram of rice takes? How many of you know that? Of course, if you don't know the number, we can't change it, right? I wanted to give it some thought. We eat rice all the time. We should ask the question, what is the environmental footprint of rice production? What if we can grow rice with minimal water? What if biodegradable packaging impregnated with seeds? So we are going to sell a lot of these packages. Packages are important. It makes it nice and it's good, it's aspirational. What if we get biodegradable packages? And I'll just go one step further, at least partly for fun. What if we impregnate it with seeds? So you throw it anywhere you want, you get a brinjal plant or a tomato plant. How many of you think technically it is possible? Yes, no? Believe me, somebody is doing it, not in India. That's the sad part. Go to North Carolina, there are researchers who are working on impregnating biodegradable packaging with seeds. So people in villages, because recycling packages from villages in India is almost an impossible task, because people use whatever they want and throw it everywhere. So if they also can buy stuff saying, I want 10 brinjal packets and 10, not only shampoo, but it'll also grow brinjal, which is not a bad thing. So I think India has the opportunity to move away from compliance and move very, very rapidly into other areas. So the Indian opportunity, apart from handling volatility through cash management, receivables management, and so on, is really changing our mindsets and changing our inability to hold on to existing management systems. What we need is high-tech hybrid solutions, embrace constraints for innovation, co-creation with private-public sector, look at price minus profit equal to cost so that we make it affordable, thinking big of global opportunities, and focus on inclusion so that everybody can get the benefit of a good quality of life. So I believe that poverty alleviation, sustainable development, inclusive growth are intimately linked. Our current industrial developmental model, not only in India but around the world, but particularly in India, in terms of use of energy, water, packaging, and waste per capita, are inappropriate and not sustainable. So the breakthrough innovations that will have to happen here in emerging markets, and especially in India. But it cannot happen unless you change the tone at the top. Senior executives and CEOs and business leaders, business schools must focus on sustainability as a business agenda, not as CSR, not as a good thing to do. New product design skills, new operational skills, new partnering skills, and new approach to migration of capabilities. So if you look at where we started 15 years ago, 10 years ago, in our journey to build globally competitive India, Our first concern was competitive strategy, cost, quality, speed, and scope. Sustainable development can stall this process by looking at preserved natural resources used less. But I believe our motto should be get more for less for more people. That, I think, only India can do, and it's also very Gandhian. So my good friend Mashelkar calls it Gandhian engineering or extreme engineering, where we recognize we have to include all people, therefore we have to do with less for more people. That, I think, is our challenge, and it's our unique opportunity to make a big difference. If you can pull it off here in India, you can take it anywhere else in the world. And this crisis allows us an opportunity for regulatory policy change, governmental incentives, but much more important, private sector initiatives to create a very fundamentally different way of industrial development rather than replicating what has happened elsewhere. And we will have an uncontested opportunity for a couple of years because nobody else is going to pay attention to this. I believe sustainability agenda will take the back seat in most European countries, at least for 3 or 4 years. This is our chance to move. So, as always, I like to finish by saying, let us have the imagination, the passion, and the courage, and humanity and humility to do it. The opportunity is there. I believe the current crisis does not affect India in the same fashion that it affects the rest of the world. Some sectors will be hurt, but not overall growth in India. India is a strong player at this point in time. We have the ability to get resilience and agility if we can combine it with strategic clarity and a volatility innovation sandbox. We can pick and choose the game that we want to play. So I do recognize that you have to conserve cash, you have to declare war on waste, but this is only the starting point. That will not take us to the next ground, it'll just buy us time. And I want to make a distinction between approaches to management that buys us time and that takes us to the next round. I wish you all the very best. Thank you.
Thank you very much for everybody for keeping out, staying with us and taking out time to listen this lovely lecture and paying homage to our own management guru, late C.K. Prahalad sir. I hope you enjoyed this session, everyone, and we look forward to your participation in future programs also. Thank you and good night.